This is a weird morning. I came into this morning knowing what I was going to preach on and knowing that it's a good way to have less people next week. The parable, the rich man and Lazarus, is a difficult parable. There's a couple of harder ones that we'll get to, but this one's a hard one, particularly in our society. And so I just want to say that ahead of time, that I recognize it is a difficult parable. If we understand the parables, almost all of them are. Very few of them are written as a, hey, you're doing a great job. Most of them are written in a sense that if you're paying attention, they're warnings, they're cautions about how you understand the kingdom. Next week's sermon is the second half of this one. Originally was going to just be a one-week sermon. I couldn't figure out how to do that adequately, so it's a two-part sermon. So if you're unable to make it next week, well, it'll be online, and then it'll also be on YouTube or wherever we store those. So this sermon, I titled it, Not My House. That'll become clear later if you don't know what I mean by that now. Just a caution as we go forward. This sermon is about money. It's something that's helpful to know, good on the front end to tell people what they're getting into, what they could get out of if they want to. But the sermon's about money. There's no other way to look at this parable. It's about money. And specifically, it's about your money. And so if you feel like, well, that sermon was targeted at me, it was, not by me, but it is. The parables are written for you to read them for your life. There's no general application of these things. And so you should know that. It's written about money, it's written about your money, and it's written about hell. And so there's a component of hell in this, and it's not popular in church to talk about hell. We're not going to spend a lot of time focusing on it, but you should understand that as we get into this, this parable is about your money and hell. And so we'll get right into it. Before I get right into it, a couple of things you should know. I'm paid $8,000 a month. You should know that. So when I give this sermon, it's not from a position of, wow, those rich people out there. I recognize that I make more on an average month than a large percentage of Americans do. And so there's the danger of me preaching this sermon in a hypocritical way. It's possible for you to hear it as a hypocritical statement, because not only I make $8,000 a month, I went to Cancun last year on vacation. It's a nice place, sun, sand, cost some money to get there. So it's still a danger for me to preach, talk about this parable that's about money, mine, yours, it's about hell. When I make a reasonably good amount of money, I vacation in nice places sometimes. My car is out in the parking lot. I drive a Honda Accord. It's not the nicest car on the planet, but it's not the cheapest car on the planet either. When I bought this car a couple of years ago, I made a decision of how much money I was going to spend on a car based on a few things, which I'm not going to go into right now. If you want to know how I got to that place, I'd be happy to tell you. But I want it to be on the table as I talk about my money, your money, and hell, that I am also aware that I have a better standard of living than some of you. Some of you have a better standard of living than I do. But that's not what this parable is about. So I can stand here and talk about it. I have to evaluate myself by it as well. So I wanted that to be out there before we get started. Talked last week about the three layers of parable. The first layer is the story. The second layer is the interpretation. And the third layer is the application. So the story is just what's here in the Bible. The interpretation is, okay, how do you understand that? What's Jesus saying? And then the application, the thing that we want to get, is what do we do with it? So if we get through with this parable and go, that's a nice story, haven't gotten anything useful out of it. If we haven't taken the story and said, I got to evaluate my life and my finances and my use of finances by this parable, then the parable is of no value, except perhaps to be an I told you so when you find out later that you did it wrong. So that's why we would look at this parable. So here it is. There was, and I can't. We had to replace out this monitor. I don't know if you remember last week that this monitor wasn't working. I had to go from back there. So my tech team was an amazing set of people. Found out this thing's broken. So they took it off and put a new one here. But unfortunately, it's off the screen just a little bit, so I can't see it all, but I'm going to read it from up there. just this piece. There was a rich man who was dressed in purple and fine linen and lived in luxury every day. At his gate was laid a beggar named Lazarus, covered with sores and longing to eat what fell from the rich man's table. Even the dogs came and licked his sores. It's a tough start, isn't it? Just that image. That's where I get stuck. There's a dog coming and licking a man's sores. But before we get to that, there's a couple of things to put into place before we read this, because this parable is in the context of all of Jesus' narrative. And I want a couple of other things out there, so we're going to take a skip back to Matthew 22. Teacher, what is the greatest commandment in the law? Jesus replied, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment, and the second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. All of the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. And we're familiar with that. We've talked about this as a theme verse for our church since we began. Love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Love your neighbor as yourself. But what does that mean? What does it mean to love your neighbor as yourself? So through this sermon, I'm going to give us 3 questions to ask, because remember, this is a 2-part sermon. I'm going to leave us with 3 questions, and we're going to stop, and it's going to feel like the 5th Star Wars movie. Han Solo frozen in the kryptonite or whatever it is, and it's like, what, we're stopping here? It's the worst movie in history until they get the next one so we can find out what happened. That's what we're going to do today, so be aware of that. Our first question is this: what does it mean to love your neighbor as yourself? Without an answer to this question, this parable that we're going to get to will be very difficult to wrestle with. What does it mean to love your neighbor as yourself? And we've got a little hint up there. See the parable of the Good Samaritan, Luke 10, 25 to 37. If you want to know the answer to what's your neighbor, go read that parable. We'll have to do a sermon on it too so we understand all its pieces, but it's a good starting place. What does it mean to love your neighbor as yourself? The second piece we want to have on the table before we get to our parable: who then is the faithful servant and wise servant? This is the parable that Terry Pallas preached on. Whom the master has put in charge of the servants in his household to give them their food at the proper time. The faithful and wise servant. The master put in charge of the servants in his household. So there's a servant that's in charge of the whole household. Who does that person represent? In that parable that Pastor Terry preached on, that faithful and wise servant, who does that represent? And I think it represents us. It's us that's been put in charge. So when we look at this, we've been put in charge of something. What have they been put in charge of? Of his household. The servant that wants to be faithful and wise has been put in charge of a piece of the master's household, a property that he owns that takes servants to make it work, and food coming in, and cooks cooking the food, and gardeners gardening the gardens, and all that. Somebody's been put in charge of running that. In this parable, it's us that is representing. We've been put in charge of something. So our second question is this: is the stuff you have, your money, your house, your possessions, is it God's estate or is it your stuff? The stuff you have, your money, what's in your wallet, what's in your bank account, what's coming in your paycheck, the house that you live in, the car you've got, whatever it is, your set of golf clubs or whatever it's got, is it God's or is it yours? Because if you don't have that answered, then again, this would be very hard to grapple with. Are you conscious of being put in charge of something? Or is it something that you have that sometimes you're willing to let others perhaps have access to? The issue of ownership is very central in the concept of following Jesus. Who actually owns it? So now we'll get back to our parable. There's this rich man. Got this guy who's got a lot of money. Is this parable about rich? No. Is it about can't be rich? Is it anti-rich? I'm not going to give us a definition of rich because it's very different between the United States or Canada or Mexico or Kenya. It depends on where you're at. Rich is different. Until you go, let's start with, how is the whole world in terms of wealth? And then we take this parable and go, all right, There's a rich man. Is it against being rich? Here's why we know it's not against being rich. Abram, in the time that this verse is from, Genesis 13, this rich guy, as we know, he's going to die and end up in Hades, looking across a gulf where the poor guy is, and the poor guy is with Abraham. I'm skipping ahead, but you're good with that. He's there with Abraham, and we know Abraham's representative of heaven. And it says right here, Abram was very rich in livestock, in silver, and in gold. One of the wealthiest people that have ever lived, Abraham, in heaven. So it's not against being rich. Please understand, as we move forward here, this parable is not anti-rich, but it is anti-something. There was a rich man who was dressed in purple and in fine linen and lived in luxury every day. This defines the kind of wealth that this man has. There's a rich man dressed in purple, the most extravagant of colors, dressed in purple, fine linen. Wasn't just a purple bag. It wasn't a piece of canvas. It was fine linen. And he lived in luxury every day. So there's two things that are represented here, that he's living in luxury and he's living in leisure. He's living in luxury. We know that because he's wearing the fine robe. We know he's in leisure because he's sitting every day. It wasn't a temporary thing. It wasn't his life is multifaceted. What it says is there is a rich man who was dressed in purple and fine linen and lived this way every day. So he has the problem of the two L's. Luxury and leisure. Is this parable anti-luxury? No. Is it anti-leisure? No. It's anti-everyday. We'll get to what that means. But it's focused on this man's focus. Luxury and leisure every day. At his gate was laid a beggar named Lazarus, covered with sores. So this guy is put at his gate. That means within his jurisdiction, in his territory, in this place that he's responsible for. It doesn't say who set this guy there. Why? Because it doesn't matter. It means that this guy was in his sphere. But he wasn't part of his family. It wasn't part of his social group. It wasn't part of his clique. He was this guy who was set there that was outside of his comfort zone, but inside of his territory. He's set right outside on his gate, the place that he's responsible for. A guy covered in sores, longing to eat what fell from the man's table. What is it trying to show us there? That the man's needs were obvious. That the man's needs were right there in front of him. Health and food. But not just health and food, because he's sitting outside of the gate of this man who's got nothing going on, and he has no connection with him either. So this man not only needs food, medical attention, he needs care and companionship. He needs some level of humanity. But instead he's ignored. There's no place in this story, parables don't drag on and on, but there's no place in this story where there's even eye contact between the rich man and the man at the gate. He's sitting there, he wants to eat what's falling off of the table, and then it pushes the story even further. Even the dogs came and licked his sores. The dogs took care of him, and this man did not. The dogs came up. Now, when I hear this, I'm kind of grossed out. I don't walk around with a bunch of sores, but occasionally, I'll skin my knee, bang my hand or something, get a wound on it. I have a dog. If my dog thought, I'm going to lick that wound, that would be the end of that thought. Because that's not anything in my... But it turns out it's actually the dog trying to care for the problem. That's what animals do. They clean wounds with their tongues. That's why we're not animals. We don't. But this dog, set of dogs, that shouldn't be anywhere near this man because this man should be cared for in some other way are coming to care for the man. Well, the rich man is inside in leisure and luxury, not caring. Does it say the man doesn't care? It doesn't. It's showing him absolutely ignorant. It shows him not caring about that man, but him not caring about any men. He didn't walk out and go, I don't want to take care of this one. If we get to the parable of the Good Samaritan, remember there's an intentional oversight. I'm going to walk down the other side of the street. I'm aware of a need, and I'm going to ignore it. This parable is different. This parable shows a man who's so consumed, he's not even aware of what the dogs see and try to fix. So what we have is a man who is completely wrapped in luxury and leisure. The time came when the beggar died, and the angels came to him and carried him to Abram's side. The man dies, still unattended, except by God. Remember, God doesn't need us, but He wants to use us. The angels were there. We don't know what sort of care was being taken care of in this man's spiritual life because the parable isn't about that. But what we know is instantly at the moment when this man dies, he's taken to heaven by the angels. The rich man, not so fortunate. The rich man also died and was buried. It doesn't say anything about the transportation that takes place there, but it very clearly leaves out the angels. So this man, who was very wrapped up in taking care of himself, finds himself at the time when he needs to be taken care of, not taken care of. So much so that he ends up in Hades, which is hell. We could get into the conversation about, well, what is Hades? It's not the point of this parable. This parable is clearly showing that this man ends up in hell, where he was in torment. He looks up and sees Abraham far away with Lazarus by his side. The poor man ends up in heaven. The rich man ends up in hell. So, what do we know? What more do we need to know when we're reading this parable to try to understand it? And I've talked in a few weeks past, we need to remember everything's in context. Everything's at its place in Scripture on purpose. And so what's coming before this, it doesn't say it immediately prior to the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, but it's the Pharisees who get this conversation rolling. And there's a set of parables that come before this, the ones we talked about a few weeks ago, the lost coin, the lost sheep, the lost son. Those three parables precede the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. Why does that matter? Because you have three parables to lost people, the Pharisees, about lost people and about them being found. But then you get to this fourth parable about a lost person who doesn't know he's lost and then ends up eternally lost. So you have three instances where Jesus is describing what takes place with the lost, that Jesus came to save the lost. And the Pharisees not understanding it, even up to the point of the parable of the prodigal son, they don't understand that they're being represented in that parable. So Jesus comes back again with one more parable. There's another guy who thinks he's in a good place. He thinks he's got it taken care of. He thinks he's got everything that he needs. And he's absolutely ignorant of two things: the needs of others and his own need for salvation. Neither are present. He's not aware that I'm letting somebody die on my porch, and pretty soon I'm going to die and go to hell. This should be terrifying. If you read this and understand it, you should be terrified that what if I'm missing it? What if I skip by this? If this doesn't cause an evaluation, then probably nothing in Scripture will. And we'll find out that that turns out to be true. Remember, the rich man, he's going to say, can you send somebody else? And what ultimately where it ends, we'll get to next week, is it wouldn't do any good if I sent anybody else. Why? Because you're not listening anyhow. Even a dead man could rise from the grave, and it won't make any difference. Why? Because you're stuck. How scary to be so stuck. And even a dead man could rise from the grave, and I won't get it. But I'm ahead of myself. There's a rich man died and was in Hades, where he was in torment. So the question we have to ask is why? Why does he end up there? Pharisees act like they know God, but they don't. The Pharisees act like they've got it understood, that they believe in God. They act like they aren't the lost coin. They act like they aren't the lost sheep. They act like they aren't the lost son, and yet they are. And they can't hear. They heard it from the mouth of Jesus Christ, and they can't hear it. Why? If we go back just a little bit, between the sets of parables, there's this verse, no one can serve two masters. You cannot serve both God and money. Well, I'm reading through my Bible and I see that verse, you cannot serve both God and money. Well, I don't. I just keep on reading. I don't serve both God and money. What would it look like to serve money? Well, I'd probably work on Wall Street. Maybe. Take the guy who works on Wall Street and set him over here and let him worry about himself. What would it mean to serve money? We have these questions. What does it mean to love your neighbor as yourself? It's good to take the inverse of questions. What would it mean to love yourself, not love your neighbor? When I think about loving myself, and I try not to think of that too often, but I've got it wired. I'm good at it. And then I think, how do I love others? My list of people is pretty short that I love like I love me. I really love me. That doesn't mean I really like me. Don't hear that wrong. I like me well enough, but I'm not just walking around trying to find a mirror from time. You're looking pretty good. But when I'm tired, I sleep. When I'm hungry, I eat. When I'm not hungry, I eat. When my feet hurt, I take my shoes off. I had a flight attendant tell me I had to wear my shoes on a plane. I was irritated. My feet get hot in shoes. It was a long flight. I just took my feet. They just tucked under the chair in front of me. But she saw it somehow. You got to have your shoes on, sir. She's not loving me like I love me. Clearly not a Christian. I'm good at loving me. What does it mean to love your neighbor as yourself? We're not going to answer that, but you need to answer that because your soul's at stake. It literally is. What does it mean to love your neighbor as yourself? Is your stuff God's or yours? I hear people fairly often say, God has access to all my stuff. If that's your phrase, you don't understand. What God has said is you have access to His stuff. Here's your stuff. Nothing. Here's a suggestion. Get a box. Don't put anything in it. Write my stuff on it. Put it on a shelf. Just to remind yourself. Now, to be fair, I don't have one of those. But I also have a difficult time, as much as I don't want to, I have a difficult time thinking of my stuff in terms of it not being my stuff. Why? Because I have locks on my doors. I have locks on my cars. I have accounts that my money's in. So if somebody needs it, they've got to go through what? Me. Now that makes some sense. But I don't have the locks on my doors because I'm protecting God's stuff. I have locks on my doors because I'm protecting my stuff. It's a paradigm shift for every person to go, this is actually all God's. And I am assigned to care for it. We'll talk about that next week. So the third question, are you a steward of His estate or an owner of yours? The rest of this parable will not help you until you answer these three questions. A steward, in case you don't know, is one who manages or looks after another person's property. I hesitate to tell you any more Lord of the Rings stories, but in the Lord of the Rings, the most messed up guy in there outside of Gollum is a guy who's a steward of a beautiful city. And then the guy who's the actual king shows up. And he says, we don't need no king. That's my line, but he says it in a very Tolkienish way. He got so used to being the steward, he didn't want the king to have access to his territory. It doesn't go well for him. Watch the movie. A steward is one who manages or looks after another's property. We're going to stop here for today. If you don't have those three questions, you have my permission to get your phone out and take a picture of them. Answer these three questions before next week. And if you get past the first one and feel like you've got it figured out, go back to the first one, because that's so difficult. It's so difficult. Is everyone out there my neighbor? Everyone out there my neighbor? When I look at the parable of the Good Samaritan, certainly more people than I expected are my neighbor. But more important than the answer to what does it mean to love your neighbor is what does it mean to love your neighbor as much as you love yourself? That one should take you the rest of the week. Then when you get to the second and third questions, which are similar, what does that mean? That I'm looking after God's stuff. And what does it mean even more so if I realize, which is probably true for all of us at some level, that I really feel like I'm managing my stuff and I want God to be able to have access to it when He needs it. Very different. So I'll finish with this. And if you can figure out what this is up here for, then you'll understand where I'm going next week. We're going to start with Spider-Man next week. How he fits in. Maybe you'll figure it out, maybe you won't. It's not important because I'll tell you next week. But Lord, I'd ask that you would help us with these questions, which I will put back up because Spider-Man, we don't need to take a picture of. I don't know if there is a after salvation question that's more important than what does it mean to love my neighbor as I love myself. We first have to come to a place of understanding we belong to you before we can learn that nothing else belongs to me. I don't know how to do that, but I want to do it right. I believe you put this parable in here not to cause us to be afraid of hell, but to cause us to realize how far we have to go to live like heaven. Help us. I believe every person that's in here that I know wants to be the good and faithful servant. I don't know that our world helps us. It doesn't show us how that's supposed to be done. So help us consider and ponder and think and pray and come to a place where we're willing to move forward with whatever it is you show us. Bless these friends. Grateful for them. Thanks that we could be together today. In Jesus' name, amen. God bless you guys. I look forward to seeing you next week.